I'm Patrick Worthy, and this is component-based architecture for video games. Oh yeah. Alright, so this is Johnny. Now, Johnny likes to make games. Specifically, he wants to create one that is an MMO, RPG, FPS, RTS. Whatever that is. It has guns and magic, that's all you need to know. So it's going to be a great game. But Houston, we have a problem. That problem is this game is a huge thing to tackle. You know, almost on the scale of the pyramids. He's not going to do anything to it unless he's very industrious. So if Johnny's going to be industrious and get this done, he needs to know kind of how he's going to go about doing this, before he jumps into it. So the traditional way to create a game is to use inheritance, which, that's kind of been the way that most games have done it, prior to a few years ago. And this is not great for code reusability because, if you use inheritance, what you're doing is you're coupling things together, and it's really hard to move code around because it inherits from something, and if you don't want it to, it becomes really hard. So this new component-based architecture is better. It's better for a lot of reasons. It favors composition over inheritance, and the code reusability is really high. And it's got some other benefits, but I won't really talk about those right now. Okay, so in the component-based architecture, we have things called game objects, and that's pretty much any entity in your game at all. So a hamburger would be an example. That's a great game object. Let's start there. Okay, so game objects have components, things that make up the game object. You can think of it like ingredients. So for a hamburger, you'd have the sesame seeds, the buns, the patty, the lettuce, whatever. But those ingredients, here's the key, can be used elsewhere. So the sesame seeds could be taken over to a breakfast bagel and put on the breakfast bagel. And that way, the code you wrote for the sesame seeds can be reused on the bagel. So that's great. And again, that's the primary reason you'd want to use component-based architecture. So here's some results from some other developers. This is a GDC Canada PowerPoint presentation. You can find it online. I'll post the link in the description so you can take a look at it in more detail. But here's the gist of it. So it was a little hard for some programmers to adopt to it. It's maybe not as performant as, the traditional way of doing things. But again, that's becoming less of an issue nowadays because, computers are just getting better and better. It's kind of mixed on whether or not it's better to debug using this. But overall, programmers seem to be generally happy about it. And I've actually, I've used this architecture in my own game engine, and I really like it. And in fact, that's why I'm doing a video about it. So just keep that in mind. And, check out the link. It's got a lot of good insight, and I think you'll like it. Okay. So there are two types of components, the way I see it. There's attribute components and behavior components. Now, attribute components are kind of like observable characteristics, things like eye color, height, awesomeness, how much of a jerk you are, etc. There's also behavior components, which is exactly what it sounds like. So any sort of behavior, I have some listed here. Wearing sunglasses indoors, that's a behavior. addressing anyone as dude. That's another behavior. One that I employ actually. So if I were a game object, I would add a address everyone as dude behavior component. Yeah. Okay. So that's fantastic. There's types of components. We got that covered. Oh. All right. So there's also interaction between components, specifically the behavior components, because, you know, those are the components that actually do things, right? The attribute components don't do anything. They're just data essentially. But the behavior components, they actually do stuff. So if they do stuff, there's going to be interaction between, you know, that component and other components. So consider a dead person. Hope you like my drawing skills. I used Microsoft Paint to do all this. Very, very professionally done, I'm sure. All right, so you've got a dead person. Specifically, it's a person that has a death component behavior attached to him. Okay? So for this example, we must have a hit points attribute component as well. So this person must have a hit points component and a death component. Capiche? Okay. So it's a requirement, and the death component will not function without the hit points component. So this is a key here. So we've got a manager over here in scenario 1. Notice that there's no hit points present. And the manager asks death, the death component, to do his job. Death says no, because the hit points component isn't there, and he requires it to be there. So if HP is present, on the other hand, there's this second scenario where hit points is there, and the manager says, death, do your job. Death says, okay, because hit points component is there. And death says, hit points, what's your status? Hit points says 0, sir. And death goes like, oh, okay, 0 hit points. Well, I guess we'll have to kill the person because he doesn't have any hit points. So that makes sense, right? So that's kind of one way communication between the components can happen. Here's another way. So for another sort of interaction, it's kind of like a mail system. And this one I really like, because the mail can come from anywhere. So this person is checking the mail. He checks the mail. He gets a letter, right? He opens it. It says, from your worst enemy, dear player, you are dead. I killed you with a rocket launcher. Sincerely, the enemy. So, of course, Death gets wind of this, and he's like, okay, you're dead. And that's how the player dies. So that's kind of how messaging works in games. And that message could come from anywhere, from anyone. So it doesn't necessarily have to be an enemy that sends the message. It could be some sort of tar pit that you fall into. You know, that's another way you could die. You could bite the dust that way. So the tar pit could send you a message, potentially. All right, so that's messaging. And that's also the end of this video. So thanks a lot. Like our Facebook, because that's all we have at the moment. And see you next week. All right. Adios.